Chapter 8: The Change of Power. On March 22, 1920, the Emperor of India dropped anchor in the Sebastopol roadstead. It was a radiant spring day. The blue sky was reflected in the calm sea, and Sebastopol, bathed in sunshine, lay white and glittering on the hills that surround the bay. People were moving busily about the quays in all directions. Many small sailing and rowing boats were crossing the bay. The atmosphere was so normal that it was quite impossible to realize that this beautiful town was on the verge of ruin, that in a few days, perhaps, the red waves would submerge it, and red agents execute bloody reprisals there. A large ship's boat flying the St. Andrew's flag came alongside. An officer climbed the ladder onto the bridge. He told me that he had been sent to me by the commandant of the fleet, and that a suite had been reserved for me on the cruiser General Kornilov. I ordered my luggage to be transshipped to the cruiser and decided to go ashore at once and see General A.M. Dragomirov, the president of the military council. According to the officer who had come to meet me, a meeting of the council had begun at midday in the Grand Palace, where the commandant of the fleet had his quarters. General Dragomirov was there also. The first acquaintance I met after landing was General Ulugay, commander of the Caucasian Army. This army, composed of Kuban and Terek Cossacks and some of the Don Cossacks, had not been able to embark and was retreating along the shores of the Black Sea on the Sochi and Tuapse road. An enormous crowd of refugees was following it. General Ulugay said that the number of Kubanians and refugees amounted to 40,000. In addition, there were 20,000 Don Cossacks. The units were utterly demoralized, and there was little use in hoping that they would put up any serious resistance to the enemy. Officers, as well as Cossacks, showed great hostility towards the volunteers. They reproached General Denikin and the volunteer regiments for having seized all the ships and escaped from the Crimea, abandoning the Cossacks to their fate. The Cossacks were retreating across a mountainous country where communications were very primitive. They were being pursued by Comrade Budenyi and his cavalry force, which was inferior in numbers to ours, but greatly heartened by its victory. The Kuban and Don units had abandoned most of their transport. The necessary provisions were unobtainable as they went along, and both men and horses were weak from hunger. It was still very early spring, and the grass had only just begun to come up, so that the horses had to eat withered leaves and gnaw the bark of trees. The Cossacks had confiscated the people's last reserves of food and were living on horse flesh and the maize which had been gathered in at the last harvest. General Ulugay had left his army near Sochi. Recently, disputes had broken out amongst members of the Kuban Rada. The number of voices clamoring for negotiations with the Bolshevists was increasing. Others proposed that Georgia should be asked for help. General Bukretov, the Ataman of the Kuban, and the engineer Ivanis, president of the Kuban government, had started for the Crimea. I asked Ulugay, "Does our numerical superiority entitle us to hope for at least a partial success, say the recapture of Novorossiysk, which would make a re-victualling possible? Once we have re-established and reorganized our forces there, could we not attempt to take the initiative out of the enemy's hands?" But General Ulugay answered me with a discouraging gesture. "We cannot do anything. The Cossacks will not fight. The regiments have completely lost their nerve." Then I realized clearly that the situation was hopeless. The officers had lost their nerve as well as the Cossacks, and we could not rely on the Cossacks to continue the struggle. Nearly 25,000 volunteers and 10,000 Don Cossacks, including those from behind the lines, had been sent down into the Crimea. The Cossacks had arrived without horses and even without arms. Whilst they were landing, they had actually thrown away most of their rifles. The regiments were absolutely demoralized. They were in such a condition that General Denikin had agreed with General Bogorevsky, the Ataman of the Don, and General Sidorin, commander of the Don army, to drop his plan of entrusting the defense of the Kerch Straits and the shore of the Sea of Azov to the Don units. He decided instead to re-embark them immediately and transport them to the Upatona area, first confiscating the last of their arms. The volunteer regiments had arrived in a similar condition of complete disorganization. The cavalry had no horses, and all the units lacked transport, artillery, and machine guns. The men were in rags and felt very bitter. For the most part, they refused to obey their officers any longer. Under these conditions, the contingent from the volunteer army no longer constituted an effective fighting force. The front was being held by General Slokchov's units, which had been amalgamated and now formed the Crimean Corps. This corps consisted of innumerable remnants of other military units and also of embryonic ones, general staffs and regiments of the line. There were quite 50 infantry and cavalry units and not more than 5,500 combatants, 3,000 bayonets, and 2,000 sabers. The enemy had the 13th Soviet Army on General Slokchov's front, and its effective force was about 6,000 bayonets and 3,000 sabers. Under these conditions, General Slokchov's forces were sufficient to defend the isthmuses, but the disparities in the makeup of the various units and their lack of preparation, as well as the enemy's gradual flow of reinforcements which our scouts reported, made our position less secure than it at first sight appeared. I found General Dragomirov at the Grand Palace. The meeting of the military council was due to begin in an hour's time, so he hastened to tell me of the most recent events. There had been too many people at the conference, which had met the evening before. In spite of all General Dragomirov's efforts, it had failed to come to a definite decision. A large number of the participants had refused on principle to discuss the question of the election of a successor to the commander-in-chief, for they considered it inadmissible to introduce the electoral principle into the army and thought that General Denikin himself should appoint his successor. General Slokchov withdrew from the conference and left Sebastopol on the pretext that his presence was needed at the front, and the representatives of the Crimean Corps left with him. After the conference, General Dragomirov communicated the results of the first meeting to General Denikin, who was at Feodosia, and told him of the views which had been expressed. But General Denikin categorically refused to appoint a successor and repeated his demand that the military council should choose a new commander-in-chief. I personally considered it absolutely inadmissible that a new commander-in-chief should be elected by his future subordinates, and a nomination by General Denikin seemed to me to be the only right way of securing the succession. I told General Dragomirov of the English ultimatum that I had brought. What with the information I received at Constantinople and the news I heard from General Ulagai and the Allies' decision to give us no further help, I see no possibility of continuing the struggle, I told him. I have come here because I cannot refuse to share with the army what are, perhaps, its last hours, and if fate calls me to the leadership of the army, I will accept the ordeal. But I do not think that General Denikin has the moral right to abandon the work which has been entrusted to him. It is his duty to finish his work and to take full responsibility for whatever happens. The commander-in-chief has definitely decided to resign. I am sure he will not change his mind, answered General Dragomirov. 1. The adjoining room, in which the meeting was to be held, was gradually filling up. Noises, voices, and the trampling of many feet could be heard. An aide-de-camp had brought in some papers and left the door ajar, and I could make out a crowd of several dozen men or more. That's not a military council, Your Excellency. It's a Soviet, I said. I do not think it will be possible to hide the new facts from the conference, and they radically transform the whole situation. I mentioned the English note. The new commander-in-chief, whoever he may be, ought to know exactly what his comrades in arms expect of him under the circumstances. They, in their turn, ought to know what their new chief can promise them. It is impossible to discuss the issues in such a large meeting, and in one composed so largely of young boys. There are regimental commanders here who in normal times would scarcely be lieutenants. I think we ought to weed out from the council all those below the rank of Army Corps Commander or its equivalent. General Dragomirov agreed willingly. He dismissed all the members of the council I suggested and requested the superior officers to come into his study. The news of the English ultimatum alarmed everybody. All realized its gravity to the full and became gloomy and silent. General Dragomirov announced that General Denikin was still insisting on the election of his successor. But all the members of the council still considered this course to be inadmissible. The president of the meeting proposed the following compromise. The superior officers should meet in unofficial conference, discuss their views, and suggest the man whom they thought most capable of doing what was to be done. General Dragomirov should then report their decision to General Denikin, emphasizing, however, that the opinion of the members of this meeting did not bind the commander-in-chief in any way, and suggesting once again that General Denikin should promulgate an edict appointing his successor. I asked permission to speak and explained once again what I had already told General Dragomirov. Under the present conditions, I could not see any hope of a successful struggle. The English ultimatum had destroyed our last hope. We had now to drain the bitter cup to the dregs. In these circumstances, General Denikin had no right to leave the army. My words were received in icy silence, and I saw clearly that the question of General Denikin's resignation was already regarded as settled by all present as well as by the general himself. And even if General Denikin leaves the army, I continued, and the heavy cross falls to one of us, that man ought to know exactly what his electors expect of him before he accepts the post. I repeat that I do not think that the new commander-in-chief can possibly promise a victorious issue. The most we can demand of him is that he keeps unstained the honor of the Russian flag which has been entrusted to the army. It is true that I am not so well acquainted with the general situation as everybody here, and maybe I exaggerate its hopelessness, but I believe that it is essential to be clear on the question before we do anything else. No one said a word. At last, General Makarov began to speak, saying that, although there seemed to be no way of escape from our situation, we ought to continue the struggle. As long as we have 100-to-1 chance, we ought not to lay down our arms. Yes, Peter Semenovich, you would be right, General Chatilov answered, if we had even one chance. But I think the enemy has not only 99 chances, but 99, and then 9 more. General Makarov had no answer ready. I had no doubt that the members of the conference would choose me. The die was cast. I had said my say. The rest did not depend on me. I pleaded fatigue and asked General Dragomirov's permission to leave the meeting. My heart was unbearably heavy, and I wanted to be alone so that I could think clearly. I left the palace and went for a stroll in the town, seeking solitude. I reached the famous boulevard and paced its deserted walks for a long time. I could not lose my feeling of intolerable oppression, and began to feel that the only cure for my mental anguish would be the comfort of unburdening my soul of all that tormented it to a sympathetic listener. Then I remembered a visit I had paid to Pyotr Benjamin, Bishop of Sebastopol, when I had been passing through the town on the eve of the evacuation of our native territory. I had been suffering deeply then also, and I had enjoyed a cordial conversation with Pyotr Benjamin, imbued with sincere mutual sympathy, which had eased my mind considerably. I decided to go and see him now. He had already heard of my arrival and seemed pleased to see me. "You did right in coming here. God has inspired you. It was your duty," he said. "I know how terrible it will be for you. I know the weight of the burden you are assuming. But you have no right to refuse the task. You must sacrifice yourself for the army which is so near to your heart and to Russia's. Divine Providence has chosen you out, working through men who believe in you and are ready to put their fate in your hands. Before you arrived here, and immediately after General Dragomirov had called the military council, many Russian men wrote to him nominating you, Orthodox clergy, Catholics, Musulman, and political and social organizations. Wait a moment, here are copies of 2 such petitions." Pyotr Benjamin turned over the papers spread out on the table and passed me 2. Whilst I was reading them, the bishop went into an adjoining room and brought back an antique image of the Holy Virgin, framed in gold and adorned with pearls. He came over to me. "I made up my mind to bless you with this image as soon as you should arrive here for your new venture." I knelt, and the bishop blessed me. A great weight fell from my heart. My mind was once more at rest, and resolving to submit to fate calmly, I went back to the Grand Palace. The conference had been over for some time. The next meeting had been fixed for 6 o'clock that evening. The superior officers had elected me unanimously as General Denikin's successor. General Dragomirov had informed the commander-in-chief of the result of the conference. Admiral Gerasimov, the commandant of the fleet, invited me to lunch. I questioned him as to our tonnage and the reserves of coal and oil which the ships would need in case of a forced evacuation. His answers were most unsatisfactory. There was enough tonnage in the Crimean ports, but not a ship could put out to sea. So far from there being reserves of coal and oil, the ships had no supplies at all. Nor was there any possibility of lighting up the warships with electricity. "Perhaps you will not believe me," added Admiral Gerasimov, "but we cannot even put the tugs under steam to conduct ships into the roadstead. If, God forbid, there should be a disaster at the front, no one will be able to escape." At 6 o'clock, the Council of Superior Officers met again under the presidency of General Dragomirov. I announced that I knew they had chosen me as General Denikin's successor, that the trust which my comrades in arms had put in me in these terrible times put me under a twofold obligation. I must justify that trust to them and to myself. Before I consented, I wanted to make sure that I was able to do what was expected of me, as I had already pointed out. I had no right to promise them victory under such conditions as then prevailed. Indeed, victory was impossible. I could promise them only one thing, that I would not lower our colors before the enemy. We would perish first. I promised to keep the honor of the Russian flag intact until the end. "The English have decided to withdraw from the game," I said. "If we reject their mediation, our refusal will give them a pretext for washing their hands of us and withdrawing altogether. I will most certainly never countenance negotiations between ourselves and the Bolshevists. But I think the most important thing is to avoid giving England an opportunity to leave us in the lurch. We must throw the odium of these negotiations upon England and prolong them until we have attended to our fortifications, put the army in the rear in order, and secured coal and oil for the fleet in case of an evacuation. If you approve of my ideas, will you formulate in a special resolution the tasks you wish to delegate to the new commander-in-chief?" I suggested that it should be drawn up there and then, so General Chatilov took it down at my dictation. At the Conference of Superior Officers, originally the Military Council, which met at Sebastopol on March 22, 1920, by order of the Commander-in-Chief, to elect a successor to General Denikin, Cavalry General Dragomirov, the President of the Council, read the British government's ultimatum to General Denikin. This urges him to cease the unequal and hopeless fight, promising him that if he does so, the government of Great Britain will propose to the Soviet government that an amnesty be concluded for the Crimean population, with special reference to the South Russian troops. But it states categorically that if General Denikin refuses, the British government will give him no support or help of any kind. Therefore, the conference has expressed a wish that the Commander-in-Chief should appoint General Wrangel in his place. Once he has accepted the supreme command, he will negotiate with the Allies to secure the safety of all those who have fought against the Bolshevists and to make the most favorable terms he can for those individual members of the armed forces of South Russia who do not consider it advisable to trust to the Soviet government's guarantee of security. I have the right to expect, I concluded, that you will all sign this resolution, at all events those clauses with which you agree, and thus share with me the heavy responsibility to the Russian people which I have accepted at your request. I am perfectly aware of the weight of this responsibility, and I beg you to reconsider the whole matter just once more. I left the council chamber and went into an anteroom. 10, 15, 20 minutes went by, and still the discussion continued. Every now and then, I could hear snatches of animated conversation. They were arguing. At last the door opened. General Kutupov, the commander of the volunteer company, came in. "Will you come in, Your Excellency? We can decide nothing without you," he said. "But what is there to decide?" I asked. "Well, whilst admitting that no one can make a decision for anybody else, there are some members who will not sign," he answered. "Who are they?" I questioned. "General Turbin and General Ulagay." I hardly knew General Turbin, the commandant of the fortress, but the gallant and noble General Ulagai was very well known to me. I did not suspect him of lack of civic courage. I had to find some other reason to explain his attitude. I went back to the council chamber. Gentlemen, you still seem to have some doubts. It is absolutely necessary to clear them up, because our decision will be of no value at all unless we are unanimous, I said. General Ulagai began to explain his point of view. No one could object to the proposed decision, but he felt that, by making a resolution signed by all the members of the council, the condition of my consent, I was showing a lack of confidence in my colleagues. He was certain that not one of them would go back on his spoken word, and therefore there was no need for their pledge in writing. I am astonished, I said, to hear such words from General Ulagai, from him of all people. It seems to me that we have fought side by side often enough and had opportunity enough in other ways to prove one another's worth. I will not admit that there is the slightest suspicion of distrust between us two. For myself, I have no need of written confirmation of the spoken word of any member of this council. But nobody knows what will happen to us in the near future. Each one of us, and myself especially, will have to account to Russia of the future, the Russian people, and all those whom we hold dear. General Ulagai immediately said that he was willing to sign. General Turbin said nothing. Each went in turn to the table and signed. I was the last to sign. I have shared the honor of its victories with the army, and cannot refuse to drink the cup of humiliation with it now. Drawing strength from the trust which my comrades in arms place in me, I consent to accept the post of Commander-in-Chief. Lieutenant General Baron P. Wrangel, March 22, 1920. As I was signing this, General Dragomirov was called to the telephone to speak to General Denikin, who asked if I had been informed of the new political situation and the decisions of the conference of that morning. On being told that I had, General Denikin announced that he had issued the edict appointing me his successor. This edict ran as follows. Edict of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. Feodossia, March 22, 1920. One Lieutenant General Baron Wrangel is hereby appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. 2. Sincere greetings to all those who have followed me loyally in the terrible struggle. God save Russia and grant victory to the army. Denikin. We went into the chamber where all the members of the conference had assembled, and General Dragomirov announced that I would speak. I began to speak and immediately felt a lump rising in my throat. I was deeply moved by the affecting yet cheerful welcome which my comrades in arms gave me. I felt that amid their pitiful calamities, their shattered hopes, their sufferings and privations, they turned to me for help and support. The news that I had for them could only be a fresh blow. What was waiting for them all in the only too near future? What was awaiting our followers who were sacrificing their personal interests, their health, their very life, for this struggle for the freedom and welfare of their country? What was awaiting the tens of thousands of Russian citizens who, blinded with terror, had taken refuge here, under the protection of the bayonets of our army? Would these great sacrifices lead to nothing? Had all these tears and all this blood been shed in vain? Would this shining page of Russian history be expunged without leaving a trace? This story of the battle her finest sons were waging against the noxious exhalations of the Russian conflagration, the torrents of blood, and the ruin and shame of their country. With an effort, I mastered the emotion which was tearing at my throat and finished my address. I stayed behind with Generals Dragomirov and Chatilov, for I had decided to answer the British government's note immediately. I sent for A. Neratov, the Chancellor of the Foreign Office, but as he was ill, B.A. Tatishchev came instead. I began to dictate to Chatilov our answer to England. Tatishchev soon arrived, and I signed the note straight away. Telegram from General Wrangel to Admiral de Robeck at Constantinople. Sent from Sebastopol, March 22nd, April 4th, 1920. General Denikin has issued a general order appointing me Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia, and I have already entered upon my duties. The British government's categorical demand that we cease fighting makes it impossible for my army to continue. I put upon the British government all the moral responsibility for the consequences of the decision they have made. I do not admit the absolute possibility of direct negotiations with the enemy, but I leave the fate of the army, the navy, the population of the occupied territory, and all those who have actually fought on our side to the good offices of the British government. I consider that those who have deprived the armies of South Russia of their support at the most critical moment, even though these armies have in the past shown constant loyalty to the Allied cause, are in honor bound to ensure the inviolability of every member of the armed forces, of the population in the occupied legions, of the refugees who wish to return to Russia, and of all those who have fought the Bolshevists and are now in the Soviet prisons of Russia. I have the right to ask my subordinates to sacrifice their lives for the safety of their country, but I cannot ask them to accept an amnesty from the enemy and profit by it if they consider it dishonorable. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary that the British government should be prepared to offer a refuge outside Russia to the Commander-in-Chief and his principal colleagues, and also to all those who prefer expatriation to the clemency of the enemy. I am ready to accept the simplest living conditions for these people once they are abroad, in order to ensure that only those whose sentiments prevent them from accepting the amnesty will take advantage of the opportunity. It is understood that I give myself first place amongst the above. It is necessary that the armistice question be settled as soon as possible, so that work may be put in hand immediately by the agents of the English command attached to my general staff. The Crimea must not be handed over to the Soviet command for at least 2 months from the time when the negotiations are completed, in order that the operations connected with the cessation of fighting and the liquidation of the administrative, military, and civil organs may be accomplished peacefully. During this period, the Allies must continue to furnish the army and the population of the occupied region with everything that is necessary for them. Wrangel. I was preparing to return to the cruiser General Kornilov when I was handed a telegram from General Slachchov. It said that he thought I was in danger in Sebastopol and asked me to authorize him to come over with an armored car and a detachment of his troops to safeguard my person. I ordered an answer to be sent saying that I had no need of a guard and that I considered it superfluous to send an armored car or a detachment of troops, but that I would always be very pleased to see General Slachchov himself. Late that night, I returned to my suite aboard the General Kornilov. Dawn had scarcely come before the unaccustomed sounds of the matutinal sweeping of the decks awoke me. The chains grated, the scrapers crackled, the water thrown up by the pumps plashed, the metal bulkheads echoed with the footsteps of the sweepers. I could not fall asleep again, for my mind was tormented by irritating, worrying thoughts, so I got up and dressed, and sat down at a table to write out an order to the troops. What could I say to them to revive their flagging spirits? The difficulty and apparent hopelessness of our situation was equally well known to officers and men. This day or the next, they would hear that the Allies had abandoned us. Would not this fresh blow weaken the courage of the men who were defending with their lives the last strip of their native soil? The troops knew that I had never withheld the truth from them, and therefore they always believed me. I could not, on this occasion, any more than at former times, give them false hopes. I could only promise them that I would do my duty and ask them to follow my example. Edict of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia, March 22, 1920. By Order No. 2899 of March 22, General Denikin has appointed me his successor. Fully conscious of my responsibility to my country, I now stand at the head of the armed forces of South Russia. I will do my utmost to extricate the Army and Navy from its present difficult situation in an honorable way. I call upon all the loyal sons of Russia to help me with their entire strength, so that I may do my duty. Knowing our gallant land and sea forces as I do, for I have shared their triumphs and sufferings, I feel sure that the Army will bar the entrances to the Crimea, while the fleet defends its shores. Our success depends on this. Let us set to work and trust in God. Let Baron Wrangel. General Chatalov came on board. He had not slept any better than I. He had sat up far into the night with General Makarov, the chief of staff, familiarizing himself with the essential facts of our situation. Governmental machinery was almost non-existent. When General Denikin had arrived in the Crimea, he had applied to M.V. Bernatsky, the ex-minister of finance, and entrusted him with the task of forming a new ministerial cabinet. With the exception of Bernatsky, who was at Feodosia, and Neratov, the chief of the Department for Foreign Affairs, who was ill, all the chiefs of the civil branches of the administration and most of their more important colleagues had gone away. At the head of what remained of the important departments, only very secondary officials were to be found. Though they still had very large staffs, they had been deprived of their premises and were going about dragging round with them the remains of their scattered documents. When the branches of the administration and the different institutions had been liquidated and disbanded, General Denikin had promised 4 months' wages to all those who had been dismissed. Furthermore, enormous sums had been disbursed as evacuation subsidies. The tiny Crimea, completely lacking in natural resources, had been compelled to board, feed, and subsidize the army, as well as the excessively large organizations behind the lines, month after month. The inefficient financial policy, General Denikin's obstinate refusal to use the enormous natural wealth of South Russia to attract foreign capital, and the inadequacy of the tax-collecting machinery all led to a financial system which was summarized by its policy of issuing paper money. Even these issues, coming one after another, could not supply the demand for money, which became more and more pressing as the paper money depreciated. At the time of the retreat from the Crimea, 3 or 4 paper money printers' offices had been partially evacuated and were no longer working, as essential parts of their plant had been lost. Those which were still at Feodosia could not turn out the requisite quantity of paper money. The loss of the South Russian territories and the departure of the Allies endangered the disposal of such sums as we had in the banks, or deposited with our financial agents abroad, insignificant though they were, and our numerous creditors were already claiming them. The army had more than 150,000 mouths to feed, of which scarcely 1/6 could be considered as combatants. The rest were the wounded, the sick, all kinds of invalids, the pupils at the important and less important military schools, a large number of reservists of different ranks, most of them old men, and the employees at many institutions behind the lines. The Crimea is devoid of local resources, and in normal times lives at the expense of fertile northern Taurida. Now, with this increase in its population and with its economic machinery disorganized by long years of international and civil war, it could feed neither its own population nor the army. There was a dearth of bread already in the south coast towns, Sebastopol, Yalta, and Feodosia, owing to the difficulties of transport. The price of bread was rising higher and higher, and the most necessary fatty substances were lacking. There was no coal, and not only the fleet, but also the railway was threatened with a lack of fuel. Enormous stocks of clothing and munitions had been abandoned in South Russia, and we had nothing with which to re-equip the army, which lacked clothing and arms. We had only just enough rifles, and we lacked machine guns and artillery altogether. Nearly all the tanks, armored cars, and aeroplanes had been abandoned or had fallen into the hands of the enemy. The few that we had been able to keep could not be used for lack of petrol. Our stock of munitions for firearms, especially for the artillery, would only last for a very short time. There was no harness for the artillery we had. The cavalry had no horses. The only mounted unit was General Morozov's 2nd Cavalry Division, which was a part of General Slachchov's Army Corps. It had managed to reach the Crimea by road from the north. Except for this contingent, all the troops concentrated in the Crimea had lost the whole of their transport. The Crimea was poor in horses and could not supply remounts, especially since the fieldwork season was just beginning. The troops were completely out of hand, for the confused retreat had been going on for several months. Drunkenness, abuse of authority, pillaging, and even assassination had become frequent at the centers where the units were stationed. Dissoluteness had also affected the higher command. They interfered in politics, intrigued, and mixed in undignified quarrels. The atmosphere was highly favorable to adventurers of all kinds, both on a petty and a large scale. The high command of the Don troops also left much to be desired. General Sidorin, the commander of the army, and his chief of staff, General Kelchevsky, had definitely broken with the volunteers and were leaders of a separate Cossack policy, seeking support from the Cossack democracy. General Slashchov, formerly omnipotent master of the Crimea, had remained at the head of his army corps after its headquarters had been transferred to Feodasia. General Schilling had been put at the disposal of the commander-in-chief. General Slashchov, excellent and energetic officer as he was, showed himself well able to cope with his mixed, disparate units. With only a handful of men, and in the midst of disaster, he had held the Crimea, but his complete independence, the absence of all control, and the impossibility of his being called to account for his actions had turned his head. He had an unbalanced temperament and a rather weak nature, and fell an easy prey to the basest flatteries. He was a bad judge of men, and moreover, had an unhealthy taste for drink and drugs. He had lost all sense of propriety in the general atmosphere of dissoluteness. No longer content with the role of military leader, he thrust himself into an influential position in general politics, inundating headquarters with different projects and demands, each more absurd than the last. He insisted on the discharge of a whole list of officers, demanding that the profession be opened to other more suitable men. The internal administrative machinery was in a state of complete decay. It had evolved from a personal dictatorship to a democratic government, which left the commander-in-chief the direction of only the armed forces. Thus, General Denikin had jumbled up all the cards in his political game. If firm and accurate orders had been lacking only recently, there had always been an absence of undivided and determined control in internal politics. Parallel with the civil administration, the political section of the General Staff, presided over by the Second Quartermaster General, formulated a policy according to its ideas. This duplication of authority led to inevitable contradictions. Mistakes in the appointment of local representatives of the central authority still further accentuated the muddles and exposed the impotence of the governmental machinery. The feeling amongst the Tartar population was favorable to us on the whole. It is true that the Tartars did not want to join the army and eluded mobilization by every means in their power, but up till now, the rural population had shown no hostile tendencies. The feeling in the towns, especially in the ports, with their industrial population, gave no cause for alarm on the whole, although the influence of socialist revolutionaries who had succeeded in getting into the municipalities in large numbers, thanks to the new democratic electoral law, had caused some trouble in the neighboring port of Sebastopol. The General Staff had been informed that a strike was brewing. Captain Orlov, who had escaped into the mountains with some companions, had been joined by several dozen deserters who were hiding themselves in the mountain villages. He made several appearances on the high road to Simferopol, attacking travelers and solitary policemen, but he did not undertake any larger enterprises. When the army reached the Crimea, Orlov's command was augmented by unscrupulous adventurers, greedy for gain. One such was Captain Makarov, personal aide-de-camp to General Mamaevsky. We heard that Bolshevist agents were supplying Orlov's and Makarov's bands with arms and money. Future conditions of work seemed difficult, almost hopeless. Not only had we to build up everything from the depths of ruin, but we had also to discharge old obligations. General Chatilov had found time to see General Makarov, the new chief of staff. I knew him very well. He had been chief of the military communications department in the Caucasian Army for a long time. He was a very gifted staff officer, serious and well-educated. I believed that any change of personnel, especially in these days of general disintegration, could do nothing but harm. The changes which were unavoidable had to be made gradually as the work went on and as imperceptibly as possible. The recent relations between General Denikin and myself obliged me to behave with the most careful correctness towards all his old colleagues who were now working with me. I had explained all this to General Chatilov, requesting him to have a friendly chat with General Makarov and tell him of my suggestions and ideas for the future work of the General Staff. This work took an enormous amount of my energy and meant personal activity in the rear as well as at the front. In these trying days, the personal prestige of the Commander-in-Chief was of the greatest importance. One of my predecessor's biggest mistakes had been his gradual dropping of all direct contact with the troops. I suggested to Chatilov that he take the post of adjutant so that he could fill my place at Sebastopol during my visits to the front. General Makarov's report confirmed what General Chatilov had told me. The strategic situation was as follows. Relations between the Bolshevists and the Poles had become seriously strained, and the reopening of hostilities on the Polish front could be expected any day. After the collapse of General Denikin's army, the Reds had thrown every available unit onto the Polish front, except for an inconsiderable number of troops which were pursuing the demoralized fragments of the Cossack troops. The Cossacks had lost their fighting spirit and were retreating towards the Black Sea. On the Crimean front, General Slashchov's units were faced with the 13th Soviet Army's 6,000 bayonets and 3,000 sabers. The enemy were continuing to fortify their positions and strengthen them with artillery. It seemed as if the Red Command's strategical plan envisaged a widespread offensive on the Polish front and defensive action on ours. Our troops were holding very vulnerable positions which did not lend themselves to an active defensive. During the summer season, the Sivache would become fordable in its middle reaches, and we could easily be circumvented. It was imperative to advance and seize the mouths of the Salkovo and Perekop passes. General Makarov proposed to use the least demoralized regiments of the Volunteer Corps for the projected operation. He planned to bear down on both the enemy's flanks and deliver a frontal attack, whilst troops which were still to be disembarked were to surround the enemy from the rear. I suggested to General Makarov that he should elaborate every detail of the operation with the commandant of the fleet, and at the same time get into touch with our naval base at Constantinople so that the necessary fuel might be delivered immediately. I gave instructions for the planning of our future line of defense and the making of all the calculations necessary for the organization of fortifications along it. Simultaneously, the foundations of the fortifications at the northern approaches to Sebastopol were laid. They were to cover the port and our main base. I gave instructions that the work of lifting, classifying, and registering all the abandoned material in the Crimea should be proceeded with immediately and completed speedily, and that the workshops and depots should be put in order as far as possible. I decided to put the work of re-equipping the army and the urban population of the Crimea into the same hands in order to avoid interdepartmental friction and ensure the most economical use of the meager local resources in the general interest. I appointed General Vilchevsky chief of the commissariat. He had held a similar posit in the Caucasian army, and I knew him to be honest, incorruptible, energetic, and strong-minded. We had to combine an infinitely large number of military units into compact formations, reduce the general staffs, and reinforce the ranks of the regiments with new combatants, giving some sort of regular organization to the whole army. I formulated a scheme for reducing the troops to 3 army corps, one under General Kutupov, to be composed of the units of the old Volunteer Corps, Kornilov's, Makarov's, and Drostovsky's divisions, and General Slachchov's Army Corps, in which the numerous units had been reduced to 2 infantry divisions, the 13th and the 34th. The cadres made part of this corps, and the Don Cossack units had been combined with the Don Army Corps. The regular cavalry units had been reduced to 6 regiments. Although I was preparing to continue the struggle, I felt it was absolutely necessary to safeguard the army against disaster. I urged General Makarov to elaborate a plan of evacuation as soon as possible, in cooperation with the commander of the fleet's general staff, to decide which ports the troops should make for in case of an embarkation, and to take measures for the concentration of the necessary tonnage in the ports and the procuring of reserves of coal and oil. So long as the fleet lacked coal and oil, we were in danger of a catastrophe. The provisioning of the Crimea with fuel, as with everything else, was done from Constantinople. For the resident high commissioners, the direct representatives of their government's policies in the Near East and South Russia, were there. I told General Chatilov to go at once to Constantinople and settle the measures for the provisioning of the Crimea with our military agent there, as well as to discuss other matters of a most pressing nature. General Chatilov saw Admiral de Robeck, the British High Commissioner, and General Mine, the commander of the English Army of Occupation. Chatilov led the discussion round to my answer to the ultimatum, and did his utmost to prevent the English from backing out of their part in the negotiations with the Bolshevists, and to ensure our gaining as much time as possible. General Slashchov arrived at Sebastopol. His eccentric uniform, his bursts of nervous laughter, and his confused and abrupt way of talking created a very bad impression. I expressed my admiration at the way in which he had accomplished his difficult task of defending the Crimea, and told him I was sure that the gallantry of his troops would make it possible for me to reorganize the army and put the rear in order. Then I told him of the military council's decisions. He replied that he was in full agreement with the decisions and begged me to believe that his troops would do their duty. He thought there was a possibility of an offensive from the enemy within the next few days. In a few words, I told him of the projected plan for seizing the outlets from the Crimea. General Slachchov then broached general political questions. He thought that the army and the populace should be informed of the new commander-in-chief's ideas regarding domestic and foreign policy as soon as possible. The vacillating policy of the last phase of Denikin's rule, lacking continuity and undermined by the intensive propaganda of hostile groups, had confused and bewildered everybody. Now we had to give clear and definite answers to the most searching questions and snatch away our enemy's trump cards. Otherwise, we could not restore the troops' lost faith in the justice of our cause, nor could we win back the confidence of the populace. I could make no answer to him. I returned to the cruiser General Kornilov, and that evening received a deputation from the clergy and the political groups. The deputation greeted me very warmly and expressed their belief that the Russian flag was now in capable hands. I thanked them and emphasized the value I set on their moral support in such trying times. You realize our situation. You know the weight of the burden which has fallen upon me. You have probably heard of the fresh blow our erstwhile allies have dealt us. In these circumstances, it would be dishonorable for me to promise you victory. All I can do is to promise to save you from this dilemma without loss of honor, I told them. Immediately afterwards, I interviewed certain members of the deputation separately. They raised nearly all the questions which everyone had, nearest at heart the peasant problem, which, together with the agrarian problem, had become a burning question and a powerful plank in the enemy's propaganda, the acute question of the relations between the South Russian powers and the other new states which had been set up on Russian territory, the relations between the Supreme Command and the Cossack governments, and finally the position of the Eastern powers, and particularly the possibility of German support now that the Entente had abandoned our cause. All these questions were causing great anxiety to the army and to society. My answers seemed to meet with eager approval, and my audience insisted on the necessity of circulating my views amongst as wide a circle of the populace as possible. The next day, I received a visit from representatives of the Allied military missions. During my interview with General Mangin, chief of the French mission, I discovered that he did not yet know about the English ultimatum. On March 25th, a solemn Te Deum was followed by a review of the troops in Nahimov Square. After Mass had been celebrated in the cathedral, a religious procession, headed by Bishop Benjamin, wound its way to the Nahimov Square, accompanied by the pealing of bells. On the way, it was joined by processions coming from other churches. The troops were deployed all along Ekaterinskaya Street and round the square. An altar had been set up in front of Admiral Nahinov's monument. By it stood a group of well-known people and representatives from the Allied missions. The surrounding windows, balconies, and even roofs were crowded with onlookers. The day was sunny and calm. The blue sky was reflected in the still bay as in a mirror. The hymns poured out into the silence in wave after wave of sweet sound. Not a flame of one of those innumerable tapers stirred. The smoke floated up from the incense in translucent clouds. After the religious service, Bishop Benjamin read the Senate's edict, which had arrived the night before, and which enjoined the whole population to unite under the new commander-in-chief. The bishop then mounted another step or two and spoke. "Listen, people of Russia. Listen, Russian soldiers. Listen, representatives of our allies. And listen also, you Bolshevists are hiding in the crowd there." So began Magor Benjamin's address, and his voice penetrated to the further corner of the great square. He spoke of the cruel sufferings which God had visited on our country, that it might atone for the sins of all classes of the Russian people, of the gallant deeds of those who had kept the flag flying during the years of shame and disaster, of the path of sorrow which the Russian army had already been treading for the last few years. This path is a thorny one, and its end has not yet been reached. We have just been enduring terrible trials. Perhaps the near future is preparing fresh ones for us. But faith can work miracles. Those who have faith, those who march courageously along the road which conscience dictates without losing their honor, will conquer. A month ago, the Russian army was driven back onto the sea at Novorossiysk in a dying condition. Perhaps 2 months hence, it will have taken on a new lease of life and will go forth and conquer the enemy. This speech was delivered with admirable force and enthusiasm and made a profound impression on its hearers. After the troops had been sprinkled with holy water, the regiments were massed in the square. I, too, mounted the steps of Nahimov's monument and addressed the troops. Having in a few words drawn a gloomy picture of our position, I said that I had assumed the leadership of the army without hesitation or fear. I trusted in God, who would not let the righteous cause perish, and would give me judgment and strength enough to help the army out of this difficult situation. I knew the wonderful gallantry of the troops, and I firmly believed that they would help me to do my duty to our country. I had faith that the bright day of Russia's resurrection would yet dawn. The troops marched past. Their uniforms were old and bad weather had played havoc with them. Their boots were worn out and patched, their faces haggard and cadaverous. But their eyes sparkled merrily, and their heels tapped the ground with a firm tread. They were remembering the recent deeds of their martyred heroes, and a comforting feeling was awaking in the depths of their hearts. Everything is not yet lost. We can still hold on. The following day, I moved from the cruiser General Kornilov into the residence which had been prepared for me in the town. It was called the Little Palace, and was a tiny bungalow with a minute garden, originally built for the High Admiral of the Russian fleet, Grand Duke Alexis Alexandrovich. The superior officers had separated after the military council of March 22nd. General Ulugay had rejoined his army. General Sidorin had gone to Upatona, where the Don regiments were stationed. General Kutapov had gone to Simferopol. The reorganization of the Crimean, the Don, and the Volunteer Army Corps was well in hand. The equipment had been inventoried, and the troops were falling back into some kind of order. My general staff, in concert with the commander of the fleet, had elaborated a detailed plan for the projected operation which was to win the Crimean passes for us. We were only awaiting the arrival of assignments of coal from Constantinople to launch the attack. For this operation, we intended to use General Slakhov's Army Corps, units from the Volunteer Corps, Drozdovsky's men, and Alexeyev's. When the campaign was over, I wanted to concentrate the volunteers in the northwest part of the peninsula and entrust the defense of the Perekop Isthmus to them, whilst the Crimean contingent could be concentrated further east to defend the Salkovo and Genichesk passes. Ranged along the railway to defend a much reduced front, it could rest and reorganize quite peacefully. M. Perlik, the governor of the Crimea, came from Simferopol. He was very uneasy about the provisioning of the town. Owing to the disorganization of the railways, the transport of corn from the northern agricultural part of the peninsula to the coast towns had ceased. The appearance of a large number of troops and refugees in the Crimea had made the question still more acute. There was also a dearth of other necessary foods. Meat, tea, and sugar were lacking. The excessive and disorderly requisitioning by the troops had completed the economic disruption and infuriated the population. We had to take immediate steps to put an end to this state of things. When the army had arrived in the Crimea, the Bolshevist agents had redoubled their activity. They worked especially amongst the peasant population. The agrarian question was not quite so acute in the Crimea as elsewhere in Russia, but agitation based on the claim for land fell on very fertile soil there, especially in the northern agricultural districts. The agrarian question was particularly acute in northern Taurida, with its large villages and its great landed estates. We heard that the propaganda against us had been very successful with the peasants of that district. The governor of the province attached exceptional importance to the information the population had received concerning the government's intentions with regard to the agrarian question. General Denikin had hesitated to the last to cut the Gordian knot, and the question had not got beyond the stage of interminable discussions in the different commissions. The groups which were hostile to us had seized on the agrarian question for propaganda purposes, and an unhealthy atmosphere enveloped this complex problem. Even the sympathetic groups and the well-intentioned organs of the press were quite bewildered. The Crimean press consisted of a certain number of daily papers. The Sebastopol newspapers set the tone. There was Bernikin's Vecherneye Slovo, a boulevard paper of a monarchist complexion, the Yug Rosu, directed by Arkadiusz Avrchenko, which was moderate in tone, and the Krimsky Vestnik, a Jewish radical newspaper. There was not a serious national paper. The censorship left much to be desired. Its functions were nearly always discharged by assiduous officers who had neither the knowledge nor the requisite breadth of view for the work. Quite often, absolutely harmless articles were censored. They had had the misfortune to arouse the suspicions of the censor simply because he had not understood them, whilst very provocative paragraphs often appeared in the daily columns. Sometimes it would be stated, on good authority, that so-and-so, a very unpopular man because of his earlier activities, had been appointed to an important post, sometimes a reform in the army, the suppression of officers' epaulettes, or the like, would be prognosticated. Such news produced a very painful effect, considering the prevailing atmosphere of nervous tension. Lately, the press had been discussing the shackles of censorship in a very heated manner, claiming freedom of the press and such like things. The uproar had become intolerable, so I invited the directors of 3 of the papers to Sebastopol. I offered them some tea and expressed my pleasure at entertaining representatives of the local press, which stood so close to the government and whose voice had the ear of the whole provincial press. Gentlemen, my former activities are known to some of you, and you know that I have always been the friend of the press war. I attach exceptional importance to the printed word nowadays, when no sedition of the country or of the populace can remain outside politics. I respect the opinion of others, and have no intention of restricting the freedom of the press, whatever its views may be, provided, of course, that they do not favor our enemies. At the same time, I must draw your attention to the fact that we are living in exceptional times. We are, indeed, living in a besieged fortress. Not only does the enemy threaten us on the north, we have also to keep a strict watch all along the shore to prevent him landing his troops. In these conditions, we cannot dispense with the censor. Even in the freest countries, a most strict censorship is always imposed at the seat of military operations. How much more necessary is it in a besieged fortress? This censorship cannot confine itself to purely military questions, because in time of war, especially civil war, ideas are weapons of war as much as guns and rifles, and military and civil censorship cannot be separated. I do not question your patriotism, gentlemen, and would be only too happy to free you from the restrictions which are hindering your work. At the same time, I am responsible for the cause of which I am the leader, and I have to take measures to protect the army and the populace who are under its care against anything which might threaten their safety. I suggest that you choose one of 2 courses. Either adhere to the present system if I promise you that I will do all I can to improve the censorship and find competent censors, or abolish the censorship and put all the responsibility on the directors who will be answerable before the judiciary. In the event of the publication of articles or paragraphs prejudicial to our cause, they would come under the Code of Military Justice, which applies to crimes of a military nature. I ought to point out to you that according to wartime regulations, acts prejudicial to us or favorable to the enemy are liable to very severe punishment, even to the death penalty. Think over my suggestion, gentlemen, and then let me know your answer. The director of the Krimsky Vestnik was the first to speak. He hastened to declare that, taking into consideration the exceptional difficulties of the moment and all the arguments that I had put forward, he was ready to admit that the suppression of the censorship could not be considered at present. The representative of the Yug Rasu endorsed his opinion. Bernakin was the only one to declare that he was ready to assume full responsibility for his paper. After this interview, the question of the suppression or the censorship was not raised again in the press. I decided to entrust the administration of foreign affairs to P.B. Struve, a member of the Academy. Until now, the position of Director of Foreign Affairs had been nominally held by S.D. Sazonov, who was living in Paris. Being so far from the struggle, he could not possibly ascertain the facts of the new situation and adapt himself to new working conditions. He could only resign himself to the fact that the position of Russia's representative had changed, and with great dignity he withdrew more and more from action of any kind. His presence in Paris became purposeless, especially as it was undoubtedly the duty of the Director of Foreign Policy to be at the center of government. With the departure of S.D. Sazonov, there was no longer any reason for the continued existence of the political delegation of which he was part, which was stationed in Paris. At the head of this delegation was Prince G.E. Lvov, ex-president of the Provisional Government, and it included well-known statesmen who sent out protests, memoranda, etc., on different problems of our foreign policy, but had no real importance. I telegraphed to our ambassador in Paris that henceforth all communications would take place only through turn. From that day on, the political members of the delegation went into opposition to the Supreme Command and took every opportunity to discredit in foreign circles the cause which we were maintaining with such great difficulty. On March 29th, I promulgated a statute for the administration of the territories occupied by the armed forces of South Russia. The regent and commander-in-chief was to exercise the fullest civil and military powers without any limitations whatsoever. The Cossack territories were to keep their internal autonomy, but the Cossack troops were to be subject to the commander-in-chief. From this time on, the commander-in-chief had full authority over the Cossack troops. A term was put to the existence of separate regulations for different troops in the same army. This act stated the principle of dictatorship clearly and openly for the first time. Commander-in-Chief of the South Russian Army, Feodosia, March 20th, 1920. My dear Abram Mikhailovich, for 3 troubled years of Russian history, I have been foremost in the struggle, devoting to it all my strength and bearing the heavy burden of power as destiny decreed. God has not given my troops victory. Faith in the Army's vitality and in its historic mission is still alive, but the intimate ties binding the chief to his men are broken, and I have no longer the strength to command them. I order the Military Council to elect a suitable man to whom I can delegate my power and my command. Yours truly, Denikin.